Hello, I'm Jessie Gray. Welcome to Personalities. This afternoon we have a guest whom I talked to around 4 months ago and have been wanting to meet ever since. Her name is Dusty Sklar. She's the author of the book Gods and Beasts. It's about the relationship of the occult beliefs and the rise of the Nazi philosophy in Germany during, of course, pre- and World War II. She's going to tell us more about it, and I welcome you. Thank you for coming. First of all, before we go into how the occult beliefs influenced Nazism, what do you consider occult?
Well, occult simply means hidden. And occult societies usually act on the assumption that you can develop these hidden secret powers if you work on yourself in the right way and under the right master.
By hidden, though, does that include, let's take the popular forms of the occult, the astrology, extrasensory perception, the what we'd call the cultist groups?
Well, the occultists take all those ideas and claim that they're part of an ancient body of knowledge that's been lost and that only they are privy to because they're using certain rituals to restore themselves to this lost knowledge.
Now, how did the Nazis use the occult or these supposedly sacred and very sacred and what am I trying to say? Precious and privied only to a few beliefs?
Well, I should tell you that the story begins in pre-World War I Germany, and there were two occult groups in particular that I researched: George Lanz von Liebenfeld's Order of New Templars and Guido von List's Armanen. And both of these groups were patterned pretty much after the Theosophical Society. Madame Blavatsky had developed a package that appealed to many people all over Europe and in America, and she became the model for occult groups at that time. And both Lanz and List used her syncretism, but with a peculiar twist. They married Darwin's idea of evolution with Hindu ideas of racial purity and came up with the idea that the Aryan had been a lost race of supermen that had declined because they merged their pure blood with the defiled blood of the Jew.
When were these books published? When were these philosophies
Well, this was
made public?
Shortly before World War I, at the
War
turn
I.
of the century.
Oh, for goodness sake. Then how did the Nazis pick these cultist beliefs up?
Well, then, just before World War I, these two groups merged under an umbrella organization called the Thule Society. And the Thule Society did not become political until after World War I, and that eventually became the Nazi Party. But the seeds of the occult...
It became transformed directly into the Nazi Party.
Right, with the same ideology, the same platform. But the important thing is that all the policies that the Nazis then implemented were already suggested by these occult groups, Lanz and List. Lanz proposed the extermination of the Jews as a way to restore this lost civilization. He said that we ought to have a breeding colony for the Aryans so that the pure race can become strong again. And we know that Hitler read Lanz's magazine, Astra, which was like our magazines of the 30s, a pulp magazine. And it was a curious blend of racism and eroticism, and Hitler carried copies around for a long time and met Lanz.
This is really not known at all, is it? I mean, it's a completely overlooked chapter in the history of the rise of Nazism.
Yes, I was amazed at that. I mean, the way I got into it, you see, was that I was investigating a New York occult group, and they were perfectly respectable people, but I kept thinking of the Nazis as I sat listening to them talk.
And why? Because what theories did they have that were similar?
Well, they had the belief, too, that we could all be supermen, that we had once been supermen. And that only if you give your absolute obedience to the leader of the group can you advance properly in the evolutionary scale. But the main thing was, the shocker was that people coming into these classes cold with me, young, old, educated people, often of good intelligence, took on the ideas presented week after week by the leader of the group, who was a very charming, charismatic young woman. And they began to think that what was black was white and white black. And
you saw them slipping into it so easily that
right.
It suggested to you the way that Nazi Germans could have slipped toward Nazism without even
exactly
questioning themselves.
It was the first time that I saw right under my nose the possibility that people could be transformed in a short time. And that's what gave me the insight.
It's very frightening, and we want to talk later on about where America's going today and how a similar thing could rise really anywhere. Let's go back now, though, to the Nazis themselves. If the Thule Society just transformed itself into the Nazi Party, and this is really, I've never heard of that fact before, how did they then go on and use the occult to gain power?
In all sorts of curious ways. Some of the members of the Thule Society became important leaders in the Nazi Party. And I've traced in the book all the occult ideas of Himmler, Hess, Rosenberg, and Hitler. And Himmler, for example, set up the SS and used the books of List and Lanz in teaching the SS men. He referred constantly to Lanz and List's books. He had them in the height of the war running all over Europe and Tibet and Abyssinia, spent over $1 million marks during the war to have his SS men researching for traces of this ancient lost civilization.
And yet even the obvious and blatant relationship of the occult, what would still be considered occult, with this philosophy didn't dissuade people from just disassociating themselves with it.
No, on the contrary, I think the climate before World War II in Germany was pretty desperate, and many young men felt, I think, that the only way they could possibly advance was to join this utopian society, which would create a new aristocracy, and not one based on economic means, but on the purity of the blood. So they were very attracted to it, many young men were. Another thing to remember is that these men had fathers who had been influenced by Lanz and List. They were taught by teachers who had been influenced, so that this was not a totally new thing to them. But the main thing is that Hitler appealed to people on the basis that he was going to usher in a new age, and that they were going to be the new men in this new age. They were going to be the elite, and this was terribly appealing.
And he must have taken very seriously the fact that these beliefs also held the fact that a new Messiah or a Messiah was necessary, and everybody had a blind obedience to the Messiah, that was a necessary and integral part of this whole occult belief. Am I right?
Yes. One of the surprising things that I found in researching the book was that the Messiah was awaited with great eagerness long before Hitler came. This, too, began in the late 19th century. There was very much the feeling of the last days, and the second coming of the Messiah was expected imminently. And Lanz tried to put himself forth as the Messiah, and so did List, and it didn't work. But a lot of people around were preaching the coming of the Messiah. And Hitler, when he first came on the scene, did not declare himself the Messiah. He was only the herald, but gradually he evolved into the Messiah figure. And contemporary observers have written that they used to see pictures in Germany of Hitler in store windows flanked by pictures of Jesus.
Really?
And that these were yanked out at some point.
Where did belief of Jewish, the need to attack the Jews and the belief that the Jewish people were dangerous, how did that evolve as part of all of this? Why did they single out the Jews?
Well, the Jew became the personification of everything unnatural in Germany. Along with this interest in the occult came an interest in a return to primitive simplicity and nature, and the belief was that the Aryan, because he was a member of this ancient lost civilization, had special powers that he could awaken by communion with the soil and by conjuring up spirits in old stones and buildings. And so the feeling was that the Germans were connected somehow to their place, and the Jew was the displaced person. He was the urban person, and he was blamed for everything that had gone wrong with the Industrial Revolution. He was the city person, the man who was out of touch with his intuitions, and therefore could not develop these special powers.
Does, in fact, every cultist group, or we can say every political group, any group of any sort, in fact, somehow come to the point where they have a messiah and a scapegoat? Does that seem the natural evolution of at least a cultist group?
I haven't found that it's universally true of occult groups that they have scapegoats, though they do often have the belief in the special powers of the leader and the savior qualities of the leader.
Now, how did the Nazis, after they came to power, how did they change, did they change these occult beliefs to suit their needs? Was there a transformation? It doesn't sound like they even needed one from the...
I don't think of it as a transformation. I think they just...
how did they twist them? Did they?
Well, one thing they did, for example, was to banish occultists from the country. Now, historians take that as an example of the fact that Hitler was not an occultist, but I believe the opposite. I think Hitler banished the occultists because he didn't want any competition, and Himmler said as much. When he banished the astrologers, he said, we want to make this a privileged business for just us. We don't want anybody else getting into it.
Did the Nazis, in fact, have their own astrologers and their...
Yes, that's been documented in other books, and I have a chapter on the bizarre way that the Nazis used astrology in the height of the war. They tried to find out through astrology what the British were doing. And
Did they really?
Yes, another way in which they tried to find out what the British were doing was that they hired mediums and soothsayers and brought them all together in one little room and had them swinging pendulums over a map of England to find out where the minefields were that were destroying their submarines.
Did they actually act upon this information?
Well, unfortunately, they didn't have much success. The only thing that happened was that everybody's arms grew tired. But the mediums and sensitives loved this arrangement because they got free room and board and a nice place to stay. And it wasn't terribly taxing work.
Now, a Hitler youth growing up at that time, and then most of the young were forced to join the Hitler Youth. How were they indoctrinated in the occult, or was it all Nazism?
Well, Jessie, they weren't forced to join. They wanted to join. I think that it was a great privilege. Many of their parents didn't like the idea, and Hitler said at one point, I get a quite special secret pleasure when I think how the people around us don't realize what is happening to their children. But the way the children were indoctrinated was by teaching them the ideas of Luns and Liszt and using them as textbooks. And that's basically the way. But the main thing was that they were actually brainwashed, and there are many accounts of young people who came in resistant to the ideas, who joined, say, just to get on, And,
with their career, so to speak.
Yes, and then and tried to resist, and pretty soon realized that they had succumbed.
Did they realize they had succumbed, or by the time they were brainwashed, did they even realize there was anything to succumb to?
Well, I'm thinking particularly of one very bright young woman who joined just to keep out of trouble and was not going to go along with it, and was put in the role of teacher and began to teach these ideas. And then her account is that she woke up one day and found that she really believed the ideas.
She really believed them.
Yes.
What brainwashing techniques did they use, a specific brainwashing?
Well, they
technique?
used very much the same techniques that are being used in cults today. They isolated children from all other contacts with family and people who did not believe what Hitler wanted these young people to believe. They kept them 16 hours a day listening relentlessly to lectures and bombarding them with the propaganda that they wanted them to believe. And they were ill-fed in many cases.
On purpose?
Yeah.
What does that do?
Well,
lower your mental resistance?
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes. And the main thing was the isolation and the being bombarded with the propaganda.
It sounds really terribly, terribly similar to many of the cultist groups today. Do you see any possibility of something like this happening here?
Well, this is one reason I wrote the book, Jessie, because I began to look around at many of the cults that have grown to an alarming rate in America today, and I see the same sort of thing happening. There are men coming forth and claiming to be messiahs and being believed by perfectly decent, idealistic young people, intelligent, many of them. And the techniques that they use are classic brainwashing techniques, which I think people don't take seriously. We look at these cults and think they're innocuous, but they are actually using mind control.
Well, we only think they're innocuous because their proportions haven't been large enough yet to affect government decisions, perhaps, which influences directly. I mean, I guess until it reaches that level, people don't pay much attention to them unless, of course, they have someone in one and are immediately affected by it. I guess that's the basis for everything.
But many of these cults make no bones about the fact that they have political ambitions.
No, they don't. No, they don't. Is there a certain thing in society that was in the German society and perhaps is today in our society, a vacuum, or a discontent, an unsettledness that creates this?
Well, I think we're in the same time continuum. I think that there are many parallels you can draw between the climate in America today and the climate in pre-World War II Germany. There's the feeling of impotence in young people, the feeling of kids coming out of college being all dressed up with no place to go. And they join these cults for the same reason that the young Nazis joined the party. It's their promise that they will become the new elite in a new society and help to change the world for the better. And this is exactly what the Nazis thought. So from just drifting, from having a sense of meaninglessness and alienation, these kids are given a purpose.
It seems to be the pattern for any dictatorial group, because I think of the communists too. I mean, it's exactly the same pattern for a child trying to get into the young Communist Party. The same brainwashing techniques, the same idealism is brought, or at least imposed, and seems endless. You'd think it would stop after people learn and other, for instance, the Nazis have been exposed, but it doesn't stop. It just changes form a little and keeps right on going, doesn't it?
Well, I don't think people are paying any attention. I mean, I think this too happened in Nazi Germany. After the war, people said if we had only known what Hitler was about, we would have stopped him right at the beginning. And today in America, there are people who are assuming a lot of power and amassing a lot of wealth and influencing many, many young people, and nobody's doing anything. I think years from now, they may look back and say the same thing. If we had only known what this man was about at the beginning.
Do you see the cults rising to that much power?
I see that it's possible for the cults to merge under one umbrella organization in America and be taken over by a politically right group, just as happened in Germany.
You do. We were talking before the show about the reaction to your book by both the cultists and the anti-cultists. Could you go into that?
Yes. Well, many of the people who believe in the occult like the book, which surprised me, because they say it proves that the Nazis did indeed have supernatural powers. It proves the existence of these supernatural powers, and they don't go along with my interpretation of what happened, but at least they're pleased to see that I'm saying that the Nazis were steeped in the occult, even if they used the occult in a bad way.
They're saying the occult is basically good, the Nazis just misused it. And
exactly, yes.
Proof that it exists.
Now, the anti-cultists, of course, like the book because they at least are aware of the dangers of contemporary cults, and they feel that the book will alert others to be aware of this danger.
Now, it seems like almost everyone these days at least reads the astrology column, and there's a little flicker of belief of some varying occult group. What do your friends say? Do you have just, what do people say when they meet you, or they have read the book, which is strongly anti-occult in any form?
Mm-hmm. Well, many occultists are offended by the book, I must say. Not all occultists are hailing it, but they feel that I don't pay sufficient mind to the fact that there are indeed these supernatural possibilities open to us, that I'm not taking seriously the developments that they see taking place in parapsychology that they use as an illustration of the power of the occult.
And what is your answer to them?
My answer to them is that it's dangerous to believe things too quickly, and until we have scientifically proven evidence that some of the claims of parapsychology do indeed exist, we ought not to believe them yet. I like what Radhakrishnan said about that. If we believe absurdities, we shall commit atrocities, which is just what happened in Nazi Germany.
How long did it take you to write Gods and Beasts? There's a tremendous amount of research, and yet it doesn't read like a book that's just dry research. It's so full of pungent quotes and facts and historical events that it's very alive.
Well, it took me about 3 years, but
How did you begin? It was just...
I had already done quite a bit of research on the occult tradition, where certain occult ideas come from, and the history of these ideas.
What led you to that in the first place?
Well, I think I got into that when I observed that many people around me were interested in the occult and taking on these ideas. I wanted to find the source of the ideas, just to be able to understand what was going on.
Right. And then that led you toward the occult,
well, that led me
on
to,
the occult, which
yes,
then led to the book.
Well, that led me to investigate this particular occult group, which gave me this insight that perhaps the Nazis had been involved, which then led me to research.
Now, how did you research it? Where did you go? Where did you dig up this information? Because really, isn't your book the first book that's put it all together?
Well, it's the first book by a non-occultist. There have been 3 other books, so far as I know, by occultists to hint at a Nazi connection, but they haven't documented what they found the way that I think I've done. The way I researched it was I sent for books all over the country and hired translators to read some of these old books by List and Lons.
And then what?
And then it was really a question of taking what was already there and putting it in a new connection. You see, I think that the theorists on Nazi history have missed a vital element. They themselves hinted at a connection, but because they don't take the occult seriously, they didn't draw the right inferences from what they themselves found. I mean, they did talk of the Thule Society, for example, and the occult rites in the Thule Society, but they didn't pay any mind to it. I think they were not that comfortable with the occult ideas.
Do you find that the book follows you now wherever you go, and that you cannot go to a cocktail party without getting in a conversation about the subject? Do you sometimes wish it would leave you alone?
Well, this actually began to happen long before the book came out. As soon as I got the idea, I couldn't shut up about it, and at cocktail parties it would naturally come up, and I never talked to anybody but who was not fascinated by the theme and want to know more. I can't say that I'm tired of talking about it yet, no.
Now, people, if they want to buy your book, it's not in every bookstore simply through a lack of publicity, because it's really an important book, and I think will steadily build force over the years. They can't always order the book, can't they, through
Yes.
any bookstore if they don't find it at the bookstore?
Well, bookstores may be reluctant to order, and in that case they can order from the publisher, who's Thomas Y. Crowell. The parent company is Harper & Row, and I know that they carry it in their bookstore.
It's really a very important book. What are you working on now?
I'm working on a book about integrity, why some societies have it and others don't, and why some people have it and others don't.
And how do you define integrity? That's a difficult subject.
It is a difficult subject. I define it as a sense of wholeness, being all of a piece, not being divided.
And yet somebody would argue with you that somebody who belonged to one of these groups was all of a piece. You may not
That's
like the
a good point.
piece, but they're all together.
That's true, but I think that there's another aspect.
Oh, I agree with you. I just was
Yeah.
trying to find out what you thought. And how far have you gotten in your new book?
I'm just at the proposal stage trying to get a publisher. I haven't actually begun to write it yet, but I'm gathering material and looking into various fields. For example, we talked about medicine before the show. Medical ethics have changed.
Is there any one society you'd pick out as having more integrity than another? Does one stand out either historically or present in your mind?
I like colonial America myself. I think that it was the people were independent and used their intelligence.
I agree. Thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you.
Our time is up. We've been talking to Dusty Sklar. Her book is Gods and Beasts, published by Thomas Crowell. I'm Jessie Gray. Have a good week.